When a peaceful day at the park turns into a police confrontation, a father's love and a child's innocence challenge deep-rooted biases in the most unexpected way. It was a warm Sunday afternoon in Greenfield Park, Ohio. The kind of day when families filled picnic tables, kids laughed on swings, and couples strolled lazily beneath the shade of tall oak trees. Among the sea of happy faces was Carol, a black father, and his 6-year-old daughter Emma. Carol had packed a simple lunch: peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and a thermos of lemonade. They sat together on a faded blue blanket spread out on the grass, laughing as Emma animatedly described her plans for first grade. Carol was the kind of dad who cherished the little moments. His easy laugh and undivided attention made Emma feel like the most important person in the world. That day was no different. As she showed him a wobbly tooth, her bright blue eyes sparkled with excitement. He playfully tugged on her tiny braid, a smile lighting up his face. Not far from them, an older woman sat alone on a bench. Her gaze was fixed on them, her expression hard to read. Carol noticed her briefly but thought little of it. People often stared. Being a black father to a white daughter meant enduring curious glances. Sometimes they were warm and accepting, but other times, like today, the looks carried undertones of suspicion. Carol had learned to brush it off. His focus remained on Emma, who had just spotted the playground. "Can I go?" she asked, already halfway to her feet. "Go ahead, but stay where I can see you," Carol replied, chuckling as she darted off toward the jungle gym. He leaned back on the blanket, enjoying the moment of tranquility. What he didn't realize was that the woman on the bench had taken her phone out and was dialing 911. She spoke in hushed tones, her eyes still on Carol and Emma. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she ended the call and stood up. She began walking toward the playground, her steps deliberate and her expression set with a mixture of suspicion and faux concern. Emma's laughter echoed across the playground as she swung from the jungle gym, her pink sneakers dangling midair. Carol's gaze remained steady but soft. He always kept a careful eye on her, knowing the world wasn't always kind to families like theirs. The woman stopped near the jungle gym, her voice cutting through the chatter of playing children. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone sharp. Her eyes were on Emma. "Where's your mommy?" Emma froze, gripping the metal bar tightly. "I'm here with my dad," she replied innocently, pointing toward Carol, who was already standing and moving closer to them. "Is there a problem?" Carol asked, his tone calm but firm. The woman turned to him, her gaze sweeping over him with barely concealed judgment. "I was just checking," she said, her voice tinged with condescension. "You don't look related." Carol sighed, a familiar weariness settling over him. "She's my daughter," he said plainly. Emma, sensing the tension, climbed down from the jungle gym and ran to his side, clutching his hand tightly. The woman didn't relent. "Well, you can't be too careful these days," she muttered, her eyes flicking between Carol and Emma as if searching for signs of distress. Carol knelt to Emma's level, his voice soft and reassuring. "Why don't you grab your water bottle, sweetheart? I'll be right here." Emma hesitated but nodded, her small face troubled as she walked back toward their blanket. The woman crossed her arms, her stance unyielding. "You can understand why this looks unusual," she said, lowering her voice to a whisper. "A man like you with a child like her." Carol stood straight, his jaw tightening. "A father spending time with his daughter isn't unusual," he said firmly. Before the woman could respond, the wail of approaching sirens pierced the air. Carol's heart sank as a police car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable as they approached. The woman waved them over, eager to explain the situation she had fabricated in her mind. But before she could speak, Emma reappeared, clutching her water bottle and looking up at her dad with concern. "Daddy, is everything okay?" she asked softly. Carol placed a hand on her shoulder, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It's going to be fine, sweetheart," he said. The officers assessed the scene, their eyes moving between Carol, Emma, and the woman. Carol explained calmly, his voice steady even as his stomach churned with frustration. Emma's presence and innocence seemed to disarm the officers. In the end, the situation de-escalated without incident, but the experience left Carol and Emma shaken. As the officers left and the woman retreated, Carol sat back down on the blanket, pulling Emma into his arms. "You were brave, Daddy," Emma said, her voice muffled against his chest. Carol smiled softly, though his heart ached. "And so were you," he replied. That day at the park, Carol's love and Emma's innocence stood as a quiet yet powerful reminder. Sometimes, the strongest defiance against prejudice is simply showing the world the unbreakable bond of family. He replied evenly, refusing to let the woman's words rattle him. But before their tense exchange could continue, the distant sound of sirens pierced through the park's usual melody of laughter and chatter. Carol's heart sank. The woman's eyes flicked toward the parking lot, her lips twitching upward in a faint, satisfied smirk. Carol knew this was far from over. He reminded himself to stay calm, for Emma's sake. The wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the sunny afternoon like a sharp blade. Conversations hushed. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer, and a ripple of unease spread through the park. 2 patrol cars rolled to a stop near the playground, their flashing lights casting ominous red and blue patterns across the grass. Carol stood his ground, his posture calm yet guarded. From their blanket, Emma clutched her water bottle tightly, her wide eyes darting nervously between her father and the patrol cars. 2 officers stepped out, a man and a woman. Their expressions were neutral yet serious, their professional demeanor a stark contrast to the tension hanging thick in the air. The woman who had made the call hurried to them immediately, gesturing animatedly in Carol's direction. She spoke in hushed but fervent tones, her accusatory glances unmistakable. Though Carol couldn't hear her words, he didn't need to. He knew their implications all too well. Taking a steadying breath, he reminded himself to remain composed. The male officer approached first, his hand resting lightly on his utility belt. "Sir, can we have a word?" he asked, his tone polite yet firm. Carol nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Of course." He glanced back at Emma, who remained frozen on the blanket, gripping her bottle as if it were a lifeline. He gave her a reassuring nod, though her small face was etched with fear. The officer began questioning him, each inquiry probing deeper into Carol's patience. "What's your name? What are you doing here? Who is the child?" Carol answered each question clearly and succinctly, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "She's my daughter," he stated firmly, locking eyes with the officer without wavering. "Her name is Emma. We come here every weekend to spend time together." The officer nodded slightly, though skepticism lingered in his expression. He glanced toward the woman, who stood beside the female officer, still gesturing and speaking animatedly. "We received a call about a possible abduction," the officer said, his tone tinged with doubt. "The caller mentioned that the child doesn't appear to be related to you." Carol felt his chest tighten, but he refused to let anger take control. "She's adopted," he explained, his voice unwavering. "We've been a family since the day she was born. There's nothing unusual about this, just a father spending time with his daughter." Emma, sensing the rising tension, stood and walked over to Carol. She tugged gently on his hand. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice trembling. Carol looked down at her, offering a comforting smile. The officer's gaze shifted to Emma, his expression softening slightly. But the woman wasn't finished. "Just check his story," she called out, her voice sharper now. "You can't be too careful these days." The female officer stepped forward, her tone more measured as she addressed Carol. "Sir, we'll need to see some identification." Carol nodded. "Of course," he said, reaching into his pocket deliberately. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. "This is my ID," he said. He then retrieved a folded document from his bag. "And this is a copy of Emma's adoption paperwork." The officers exchanged a glance before reviewing the documents. Meanwhile, the woman stood a short distance away, arms crossed, her expression one of triumph, as if she had uncovered some hidden truth. Carol kept his focus on Emma, who clung to his leg, her small hands gripping tightly. He could feel her unease, but he whispered softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine." The female officer unfolded the adoption papers, her eyes scanning the document carefully. Her partner examined Carol's license, verifying the information. The moments stretched painfully long, each second dragging like an eternity. Carol remained motionless, his outward demeanor calm, though his heart pounded relentlessly. He had no doubts about the legitimacy of his paperwork, but the weight of having to prove his role as Emma's father gnawed at him. It wasn't just about legality. It was about the constant demand to justify his love for his child to strangers who couldn't see past their own biases. Finally, the female officer looked up from the papers, her expression neutral but slightly softened. "Everything checks out," she said quietly, her tone lacking the suspicion it once carried. The male officer nodded and returned Carol's license. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," he said, glancing briefly toward the woman, who now seemed deflated. Carol exhaled slowly, his grip on Emma tightening for a moment before he knelt to her level. "See, sweetheart, just a little misunderstanding," he said gently. Emma nodded, though her small face still held traces of worry. As the officers departed and the patrol cars drove away, Carol gathered their belongings, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders. Yet, as he looked at Emma's trusting gaze, he knew one thing for certain. No matter the challenges, he would always stand tall for his daughter. Emma, still clutching Carol's leg, whispered, "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" Carol crouched down, gently smoothing her hair. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice steady. "We're not in trouble." The female officer, having finished reviewing the documents, met Carol's eyes. Her rigid professionalism softened into something more empathetic. "Everything checks out," she said, handing back the paperwork. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Johnson." The male officer nodded, adding, "Thank you for your cooperation. It's clear there's nothing wrong here." But the woman who had called the police stepped forward again, her voice rising in disbelief. "You're just going to leave it at that? Look at them. Doesn't this seem odd to you?" The female officer's tone hardened as she addressed the woman. "Ma'am, the documents are legitimate. There is no issue here." Carol exhaled slowly, relieved but careful to maintain his composure. Turning to the woman, he spoke evenly. "I understand your concern, but assumptions like these can cause real harm. My daughter doesn't deserve to feel unsafe just because our family doesn't look like what some people expect." Emma, still holding tightly to his side, looked up at the woman and said quietly, "I love my daddy. He's the best." Her small voice carried through the park, breaking the silence like a gentle but powerful wave. The tension that had gripped the onlookers seemed to crack, giving way to an awkward stillness. The woman faltered, her indignation replaced by a look of guilt. Her gaze dropped to the ground, her shoulders slumping slightly. Around them, the crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Some people murmured to each other, their tones hushed. A few glanced at Carol with quiet sympathy, while others looked away, their faces tinged with shame. One by one, the spectators returned to their picnics and conversations, the spectacle losing its grip on the park. But for Carol, the moment lingered. Emma's innocent question, "Are we in trouble?" echoed in his mind, a painful reminder of how fragile their peace could be. The officers returned to their patrol cars. Before leaving, the female officer paused and said, "I hope you and your daughter have a good rest of your day." Carol nodded, appreciating the sentiment, though it did little to erase the weight of what had just transpired. As the officers drove away, he knew the hardest part of the day wasn't over. He would have to explain to Emma why this had happened. The atmosphere in the park had shifted. While conversations resumed, a palpable tension hung in the air. People avoided eye contact, their discomfort as visible as the sunlight filtering through the trees. Carol knelt to Emma's level, his voice gentle. "Hey, kiddo, you okay?" Emma's big blue eyes looked up at him, brimming with unspoken questions. "Why did that lady think we're not family?" she whispered, twisting the fabric of her shirt in her small hands. Carol paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes, people don't understand things that are different," he explained. "But being different doesn't mean something's wrong. We know we're family, and that's what matters." Emma nodded slowly, her young mind processing his words in a way Carol wished she didn't have to. From a nearby blanket, a couple who had been watching hesitated before walking over. Their young son trailed behind them, holding a red ball. "Hey!" The man began awkwardly, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. That was wrong." His wife chimed in, her voice earnest. "Your daughter is lucky to have you. You handled that so well." Carol gave them a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks. I just hope next time people think twice before assuming the worst." The couple nodded, offering quiet words of encouragement before walking back to their spot. As Carol gathered their belongings, more passers-by offered subtle gestures of support, a warm smile here, a gentle nod there. While these moments of solidarity were small, they helped ease the weight of the day. He turned back to Emma, who was now hugging her stuffed bunny tightly. Carol picked her up, holding her close as he whispered, "How about we head home and make some brownies?" Emma's face brightened just a little. "With extra sprinkles?" "With all the sprinkles," Carol replied, smiling. As they walked back to the car, Carol's heart remained heavy. He couldn't shield Emma from the world's ignorance, but he could teach her to face it with courage and love. And for now, that was enough. The following week felt lighter, though the memory of the incident lingered at the edges of Carol's thoughts. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered judgment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But Carol also knew that each moment like this was an opportunity to show Emma what resilience, love, and understanding looked like. As Saturday rolled around, Emma was the first to suggest their usual park outing. "Can we bring extra snacks for the ducks this time?" she asked brightly, her eyes sparkling. Carol smiled. "You got it, kiddo. Let's make it a picnic." This time, as they arrived, Carol noticed a subtle shift. The couple who had approached him last week waved from their spot under a tree. A young boy from the playground ran up to Emma with a cheerful hi, before darting back to his game of tag. Carol spread out their blue blanket in the usual spot, unpacking sandwiches and juice boxes. The simple act of returning felt powerful, a quiet declaration that they wouldn't let one uncomfortable moment define their time together or their place in the community. As Emma fed bits of bread to the ducks, Carol noticed a woman from the week before sitting on the same bench. Her posture was different this time, less rigid, more contemplative. She glanced in their direction, hesitated, then stood. Carol watched as she approached, her steps careful, almost uncertain. When she reached the edge of their blanket, Carol looked up, his expression neutral. Emma paused her duck feeding, curious. I wanted to apologize," the woman began, her voice quieter than Carol expected. "I made an assumption last week, and it wasn't fair to you or your daughter." Carol nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. The woman glanced at Emma, her regret evident. "You have a beautiful family," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I realize now that my fear clouded my judgment. I'm sorry if I hurt you." Emma looked up at Carol, unsure how to respond. Carol crouched beside her and said gently, "What do we say when someone apologizes, sweetheart?" Emma thought for a moment, then said softly, "Thank you for saying sorry." The woman smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're a very kind little girl," she said before stepping back, giving them space. Carol watched her walk away, a sense of closure settling over him. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully, with Emma swinging, laughing, and chasing bubbles with the other children. Carol sat on the blanket, watching her with pride. The park felt like there's again a place of joy and connection rather than judgment. As they packed up to leave, the man from the couple approached again. "Hey, some of us were talking," he began, gesturing toward a small group of parents nearby. "We're planning a community picnic next month. Something to bring everyone together. It'd be great if you and Emma could come." Carol smiled warmly. "That sounds wonderful. Count us in." On the drive home, Emma chattered about her duck adventures and the new friends she'd made. Carol listened, her joy filling the car like sunlight. That night, as he tucked her into bed, Emma looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy, do you think the lady from the park will come to the picnic?" "Maybe," Carol said thoughtfully. "And if she does, we'll welcome her, just like we'd welcome anyone else." Emma nodded, satisfied, because being kind makes the world better, right? "Exactly," Carol said, kissing her forehead. "You're going to change the world one kind moment at a time, kiddo." As Carol sat in the quiet of the living room later, he reflected on how the incident had shifted something, not just for him and Emma, but for the community around them. Change was slow, often uncomfortable, but it started with moments like these. The seeds of kindness and understanding had been planted, and Carol knew they would grow, because love, in all its forms, had a way of flourishing even in the toughest soil.